Here is Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel.
We are repositioning to focus on the strategic challenges and opportunities that will define our future. New technologies, new centers of power, and a world that is growing more volatile, more unpredictable, and in some instances, more threatening to the United States. We cannot fully achieve our goals for overhead reductions without cutting unnecessary and costly infrastructure. For that reason, DoD will ask Congress for another round of base realignment closure in 2017. Our proposals were carefully crafted to reform military compensation in a fair, responsible, and sustainable way. We recognize that no one serving our nation in uniform today is overpaid for what they do for our country. But if we continue on the current course without making these modest adjustments now, the choices will only grow more difficult and more painful down the road. We will inevitably have to either cut into compensation even more deeply and abruptly, or we will have to deprive our men and women of the training and equipment they need to succeed in battle.
There is Defense Secretary Chuck Hagel, a former U.S. Senator and a veteran of our armed services. Hagel's plan, released Monday, would shrink the number of troops in the Army to its lowest level since the beginning of World War II. It also calls for the elimination of the Air Force's A-10 attack jets, those tank killers that you probably recognize, and U-2 spy planes, as well as a reduction in some military benefits, and that's causing a lot of outrage. The military cuts also announced by Hagel will hurt the future, the president's ability to protect the country. That, according to former Vice President Dick Cheney. Quoting Cheney here, you can find this on Newsmax.com. I've obviously not been a strong supporter of Barack Obama, but this is really over the top. It does enormous long-term damage to our military. Cheney there on Fox News on Monday as well. Joining me right now to discuss all of this is Newsmax Magazine senior editor David Patten. David, when you listen to Secretary Hagel there talk about these cuts, is there anything that makes you feel like, yes, this is the right time to cut the military?
Not the way they're talking about cutting it. I mean, cut it somewhat, cut it a little bit, cut it modestly, sure. I mean, can you save money by trimming some fat from our military, our defense budget? Of course you can. It's a great big budget. But when you really break down the numbers, Pentagon spending accounts for about 19% of federal spending, and yet it's being asked to absorb about 50% of the cuts overall. And the concern is that with this small of an army, that this force will be too light. Remember, we've gotten in trouble before in our country from trying to fight wars with these lean forces, Iraq being a perfect example. It doesn't always work.
It does not always work, and we saw what does work when they implemented the surge in late 2005, early 2006 in Iraq as well. You know, we're talking about these benefit cuts as well. These guys, the veterans, are already you know, still smarting from the last round of benefit cuts that we saw as part of the bipartisan budget deal. I mean, how much more can Chuck Hagel put on these guys?
So, I mean, it's one thing to shrink the forces. You can do that sometimes through attrition. But when you talk about shrinking benefits, cutting benefits, you're talking about the people who've already been catching bullets on the front lines. You're talking about people and their families who already risked their lives in defense of our liberties. It seems like kind of a cheapskate way to try to balance the United States federal budget on the backs of our fighting men and women. And frankly, I don't think Congress is going to let it fly.
When you look at this in comparison to the way the military faced those sequester cuts, you know, does it seem to you like there's some similarities there in terms of the way that these cuts don't seem to be made in the smartest way?
Yeah, I could see that analogy. It's kind of a brute force, a blunt instrument sort of approach. You know, the concept sounds great. We're going to have a leaner, more technologically capable force. It'll be small. It'll be more defensive. Look, nobody wants to be adventurous, get into these long, drawn-out foreign wars. They run up our deficit, and that, after all, could be the greatest long-term threat to our national security that there is out there. But still, we have to be able to defend ourselves and our allies. We're already seeing in the Middle East, in Syria, in the Ukraine, what happens when the United States really isn't feared or respected on the global stage.
Now, on the other hand here, there is certainly this sentiment in this country, and you talked about this just a moment ago, this war weariness, if you will, and also it plays well to the Democratic base here, the true doves in our society here. We talked yesterday about how these budget proposals can be political documents, election year documents. Do you think that some of that is at play here at this as well?
Oh, it's got to be designed in large measure, John. You're right, to rev up the Democratic base.
I hate to sound so naive.
No, not at all. I mean, of course we want to trust that they're making these decisions, proposing these budgets because it's in the best interests of our military and of our country. But that's not necessarily the case. Of course, there's a lot of people on the left who are going to think this is just great. And, you know, there are also non-interventionists, sort of libertarians who feel we're too aggressive overseas within the conservative wing of the Republican Party as well. So I don't think there's any question that we have to weigh more carefully these foreign involvements. But that doesn't mean that you don't need a military. I mean, a lot of times having a strong military keeps you from having to wage that war overseas.
Yeah, and we've heard from some conservative Republicans talk about the sequester, including yesterday, about it being a good thing, that it was maybe a little messy, but the cuts were made at the end of the day. And I think this, you know, it'll be interesting to see how those folks play these cuts as well. I also want to move on because this came up yesterday during the governor's meeting with the president. These military cuts are actually going to affect the National Guard, which come in after times of emergency. Here is Oklahoma Governor Mary Fallin.
We also talked about the importance of our role as commanders-in-chief of the National Guard, how concerned we are about some of the proposed cuts that we're seeing coming out of the Pentagon, and how we feel like it could weaken our abilities as commanders-in-chiefs of the National Guard to be able to provide the type of force and strength that we need within the National Guard, especially during times of disasters.
And she knows that very well, having dealt with that horrible tornado or multiple tornadoes in Moore, Oklahoma, 2013. But this also has to be a concern because we heard the Secretary talk about the BRAC procedure, the base realignment and closure issues. And these military bases in states like Georgia, which we'll talk about later in the program, are huge economic drivers for these communities which aren't part of big cities normally. You know, so these governors have to be very concerned about these cuts, not just because of these catastrophes, but also what it could mean for their state economies.
I think this was a bigger issue on the agenda for governors with the meeting in the White House yesterday than, say, Obamacare was.
Which is kind of, you know, a head-scratcher, but obviously it shows the importance of this issue.
It's a bread-and-butter issue to their constituents. These are people who need those jobs. They need that employment. The local vendors, everybody from people who pick up the laundry to people who sweep the sidewalks, they need those jobs, and those are generated by those bases. It is interesting that there's going to be an economic impact. Is this the right time with our economy struggling to be drawing down like that? That's another question.
A huge question. I worked in Augusta, Georgia, which is home to Fort Gordon, and we went through this years ago with the base realignment and closure. It was sheer panic if it was going to set in, so I'm sure there's some nervous people out there. We want to get your take, everyone at home. If you could, be so kind to write in and tell us what you think about this proposal to cut the U.S. military. You can find us on our social media platforms, me directly at JohnB_Newsmax or at NewsmaxTV. You can also email us, connect@newsmaxtv.com, or find us on Facebook, facebook.com/NewsmaxTV. When we return, we'll have more on those military cuts with retired 4-star General Michael Hayden. We'll be right back with more after this.